Welcome everyone to today's webcast. We'll be getting started in just about 2 minutes. We'll be starting the webcast in just about 1 minute. Welcome everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webcast, The Rise of Ransomware as a Service. I'm your host, Nick Cavalancia. I'm joined today by Dr. Christine Izuakor. She's the Senior Manager of Global Security Strategy and Awareness at United Airlines, and she's also an Adjunct Professor of Cybersecurity at Robert Morris University. Dr. Izuakor, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone.
Yes, good morning to you. May I call you Christine? Is that okay?
Yes, that is totally fine.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Now, for those of you in the audience, before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes here. The webinar today is being recorded. You will be sent out a link after the webinar today so that you can replay it if you like at your leisure. We are taking questions today during the webcast. This is very much a different kind of webcast rather than death by PowerPoint, if you will. There's a very short number of slides that we have, and Christine and I are going to have a bit of a conversation about a number of topics related to ransomware as a service. So as we're talking, use the Q&A box as your way of providing us some feedback, giving us, if you've got a question, you've got some kind of comment, an anecdote, anything that you'd like to add into the conversation. I've got the Q&A box open up here on my screen, and I'm happy to interject you into the conversation as well. So make sure that you do participate. We will have a formal Q&A at the end if there's time, and if not, we'll try to again incorporate all of your questions throughout today's webcast. And because there's not a tremendous amount of slides, I think we've maybe got 10 slides total for the entire hour here. If you don't see what's going on right now, you don't see the screen moving forward, that's okay. It's because we're having a bit of a discussion. Really want you to focus on that and even participate in that discussion rather than try to bombard you with lots and lots of visuals. So today's agenda is relatively simple. We're going to talk a little bit about ransomware and the current state of ransomware itself. Going to talk about the state of ransomware specifically as a service and why that's growing. And we're going to talk about methods of protection and detection for your environment. And then lastly, as you can see here, what it is that you should be doing should you actually become the victim of a ransomware attack. Now, no doubt you guys have been paying attention to the news, and you've seen things like the coordinated attacks against a number of different government agencies and municipalities in Texas. I live here in Florida, and I've seen a number of city governments, just even in Florida, that have been hit with ransomware. We've seen it in Baltimore. And the one thing that we're seeing more and more with ransomware is the fact that it's becoming far more invasive inside of an organization and destructive in terms of how many people it's affecting, how long it takes to remediate. I think the city of Baltimore was still like 6 weeks or something, maybe even longer than that, and they still hadn't fully gotten operations back up and running. So this is a really good topic for us to discuss today. And where we're going to start is just talking about the state of ransomware. I've got a couple of stats I'm going to use to kind of tailor the conversation for Christine and myself. And the first one here is actually looking at the amount of money that is being seen as the average ransom payment. It's gone up almost 3 times, up 184%, from around $12,000 to about $36,000. This actually comes from the Coveware Q2 2019 Ransomware Marketplace report. And so we've seen this massive increase in the amount of money, and partially that's because we're no longer looking at let's say 2 or 3 machines that get infected, and that's about it. And instead, it's now leveraging code that is trying to access as many machines as possible, do as much damage as possible, to bring your operation to its very knees. From that same report here, the average amount of downtime it takes to kind of remediate the problem here, you see it's a little just under 10 days. That's a material amount of time. Small businesses particularly, 10 days out of business, you're out of business forever. That sort of thing. And then there's 2 other interesting stats that I found in this report. One is the average size of the company for Q2. For this quarter, according to that report, you see it's just under 1,000 people. That's a pretty material sized organization. What makes that number interesting is just 1 quarter previously, still mentioned in the same report, the number was only 116 people, much smaller. And so the thing that I find that's kind of interesting in these 2 stats together is that this number can fluctuate, and it really just depends on, in some cases, the opportunistic nature of the attacks, but also that it can impact businesses of just about any size. And on that note of sizes, again from the report, there was some interesting data around very specific variants of ransomware, and that those particular ransomware variants were targeting specific types of org sizes. So Ryuk, it was going after enterprises, but other ones that have actually made a huge jump up in popularity, Dharma, and I can almost not say it, Sodinokibi. Oh man, I can never. It's almost like when you first learn the word Sudoku, you can never figure out how to say it. But those ones are actually targeting smaller businesses, not necessarily like 5 or 10 seats, but not enterprises. So we're actually seeing flavors of ransomware going after flavors or sizes of organizations. So Christine, I've done enough talking. I really want to pull you into this conversation here a little bit. And maybe we can start by talking about some of the ransomware myths that exist that some of the stats I've covered touch on. So maybe can we start with the impact that a single ransomware attack has? And maybe just the question I'm thinking of is just how large of an attack footprint are you seeing?
Yeah, sure. So those are some pretty interesting stats that definitely thwart some of the popular myths associated with ransomware today. I think one of the first is that, people tend to underestimate the potential scale and impact of these attacks, right? So there seems to be this common misconception, typically beyond cybersecurity professionals who kind of live and breathe this every day, but that the impact of ransomware is more of an isolated, scare tactic that attackers use to just take over a system and earn a few dollars here and there. But the reality is, of course, these are widespread threats to businesses across any industry. And I think there are several layers to this myth. I think the first, and one that I encounter quite a bit, is that many people are just unfamiliar with how ransomware can even spread. And I see this especially with end users or people beyond cyber who believe that, if one employee clicks on a bad, email or clicks on a link or something that ends up downloading this malware, and a computer gets hit with ransomware, it's only that computer that will get encrypted. And while that's bad, it's not catastrophic for the entire company. Well, obviously that's not the reality of ransomware today and where things are heading. Many of them, like you already mentioned, are designed to spread and to infect as many machines as possible. And so once it's successfully installed on one device, it encrypts all of the data there, of course, and then starts to look for other open and connected networks so that it can spread even more. And before you know it, an entire network is down, which we've seen in countless examples where thousands of machines are getting impacted by some of these attacks. The poster child, of course, WannaCry. It's been a while since that one came about, but it's still a topic of discussion even today, just in the amount of time that it takes to recover from and respond to these attacks. I think the second layer of the misconception is about the scope of impact from a cost perspective as well. I think when people think about ransomware attacks, they automatically think about the cost of the ransom, right, and the asking price of the attacker. What's the ransom? And hopefully once that gets paid, then, we can all move on and resume business as usual. And of course, the answer to that is also no. So, like most attacks, there's the indirect costs that often exceed even what's seen at face value. So 2 main areas of concern for ransomware specifically are usually around the cost to recover, right, and then the cost of the actual downtime. So it's way more than just the ransom itself. From the cost to recover standpoint, That includes, your basics, everything from conducting the forensic analysis, investigations, trying to restore data from backups if you're prepared and have that. Some might try to attempt to decrypt the data, implementing new technologies. Training is a huge part of that. There's also the potential blowback to company reputation, should attacks be publicized. So all of those are expenses associated with recovery, and also a part of that kind of assessment of what's the impact here that we might be dealing with. I would even say that, if you choose to pay the ransom, right, that's another recovery expense, so to speak. Paying the ransom also doesn't mean that you'll get your data back, right? And so even that sort of potential or risk of having that data lost, or having to, recreate information for data that was irrecoverable also adds to that price ticket. And then I think the second piece, when it comes to cost from a downtime perspective, you can continue to double click into this and see how deep it goes. But it's important to think about, when your company is down for, 10 days on average, like that report mentioned, how much are you losing in revenue and how much are you losing in productivity potentially? I think that's probably one of the most expensive parts of getting hit with widespread attacks, where it's not just one system going down, and it's several, and it's taking down, entire networks. So, for example, if a system at a company generates, 50K in revenue per hour, which is totally reasonable in this day and age, and it's down for 10 hours, you're looking at $500,000 just from an attack, and that doesn't include some of those extra costs that I mentioned. And when you add that to or align that with the 10-day average, that's 12 million. And so even still, with those costs, that's not where it ends. There's still more. The system being down isn't the only downside, right? It's also the productivity. So if you look at, for example, the attack earlier this year against, I believe it's pronounced IEBI Schmidt, which is a Swiss-based global manufacturing company. They specialize in transportation services. They were hit with a ransomware attack earlier, faced the same fate that many companies deal with, where some of their critical operation systems were brought down by this attack, including, email and things like that. And so as they were working to recover from that attack, they had to send their employees home to, go on leave until this incident was contained. And so that's a cost as well. And so again, how much productivity are you losing from staff? And I think until you really go through it or begin to study some of these cases of what other companies have been through and peel back these layers, it's hard to fathom the potential impacts and costs associated with something as simple as, an employee or someone clicking on a link or downloading a file, and how that can spread across an entire enterprise and really cause some damage.
And put some numbers on some of the things that you talked about. The city of Baltimore, I just read the other day, the ransom was, I believe it was $760,000 what they were asked for on the first day. Instead, they chose not to do that. And it cost 18 million in recovery costs, or remediation costs, I should say. And then just a couple of days back, that same mayor, Jack Young from Baltimore, with the Conference of Mayors, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, actually put out a resolution that was passed by the U.S. Conference of Mayors saying never pay the ransom. So that actually kind of highlights the need for us to have a better plan, which you and I are going to talk about a little later on. The other thing you mentioned was like not getting your data back. I don't have the source, but I was just reading about this yesterday and doing a little bit of writing on it. On the average, if you pay the ransom, the average is people get back about 92% of their data, which really sounds good until you figure out what's the 8% that you didn't get back. Is that like all of your exchange data, or all the data in your CRM, or your intellectual property, or whatever? I don't know, and neither do you. And therein lies the problem. It sounds like a small percentage, but hey, we're going to take away 8% of your life. Excuse me, what are you going to do? That's a lot now. That sounds like that's really the idea. So, and I touched on org size a little bit here. What's your thoughts about the myth of like, oh, that only happens to to big companies and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely another huge misconception, that attackers, don't care about the smaller companies and really focus on the enterprises. I think that while there are some ransomware types, and you mentioned a couple of them that do lean more towards large enterprises, I would argue that generally the philosophy is shifting in the opposite direction. Larger companies are investing a ton in cybersecurity in general, and though it's far from perfect, of course, nobody is 100% secure ever. But they're not always the easiest target. I think the easier target are the companies that aren't investing as much in security or may not have the right technology or enough staff to develop a robust and layered security program to, thwart a lot of these attacks. And so unfortunately, that does tend to be some of the medium and smaller sized businesses, making them a more attractive target and making it more important to invest in the right tools and technology to avoid some of those things. I think in addition, smaller companies tend to have a little more to lose and thus greater pressure to pay up. And you touched on this a little bit earlier, but a few $1,000,000 lost while recovering from an attack. For a large enterprise, they may not blink twice. It's a lot of money, but some companies have survived worse, right? Versus this kind of loss for a smaller company could tank them forever. And so they have greater incentive to pay attention to this as well. Because if you think about it, like if you're a small business who's been hit with ransomware, you hadn't had the resources to adequately back up data or deploy, strong controls, you're either contemplating paying that ransom, which could potentially break your bank, or again, the downtime could tank your business anyway. And so I think that's definitely a huge misconception that we have to address, because I feel like this is an issue for companies no matter what size you are.
Yeah, I always see it as you just look at the law of big numbers. Even if someone just went opportunistically and went and got, for example, you can get a list of 1,000,000 email addresses for $300 on the dark web. And that being the case, it's that if I can go with 1,000,000, we already know if they're business email addresses, like 90% of them are smaller businesses, just by the sort of the law of big numbers because of the distribution of big and small businesses. So it just seems, even if we look at this opportunistically, the small businesses have a much larger likelihood of getting hit, if you will. Do you agree?
Yeah, I definitely agree completely.
Yeah.
I think one other myth that I want to touch on, and it kind of aligns with this topic, is the decline in the volume of attacks. I was talking to a friend of mine. I just remembered this. I was talking to a friend of mine about sort of 2019 trends in cybersecurity that we should be watching out for, and where we might be heading into even next year as the year ends. And of course, the topic of ransomware came up. And he said something along the lines of, didn't you see this report? And I hadn't seen it at the time, but he talked about how ransomware attacks were, declining, they weren't rising anymore, and that it's really not as big of an issue, and that we should focus more on, quote unquote, insert next, industry trend. There's always something new. And at the time, I hadn't seen the report, and so I was a little bit curious. And forgive me, I can't remember the name of it, but I feel like context is so critical, because even if there's I think there was a decline between one quarter and another, indicating that it's not a first choice attack method for some attackers. It doesn't mean that we have to get comfortable, because if you looked further into the information, like while the volume was generally down, the direct attacks against certain businesses and industries, and especially those companies of smaller sizes and things like that, that is still increasing. And so I think that it just means that attackers are choosing quality over quantity and going after places where they feel they can get the biggest bang for their buck, which again can still be any business. And so seeing a decrease like that without asking why can create a false sense of ease for some companies, and we just can't get comfortable like that, because it's definitely not the case.
And as we've seen in IT, there's nothing new under the sun. And what's really interesting, in fact, I'm going to put this next slide up here, talking about just a ransomware as a service. This rise of criminal activity, cyber criminal activity as a service, badness as a service, whatever we want to call it. Just the idea of breaking this up really makes a lot of sense, because there are those people that understand. Let's say the idea of just sending out emails and doing, heading up some ransomware by letting it pop up on a screen. They collect the money, and they're good with that business model. And other people are more like, no, I'm a hacker. I want to break into the environment and I want to go digging around and I want to see what I can find. And they know how they're connected to people on the dark web and they can sell data. And everyone's got a different flavor. I might know flowers really well, so I open up a florist. You happen to know technology really well, so you open up an MSP. I mean, that's kind of how it works. It's like any business at all. So it's kind of interesting because I also read stats that go the exact opposite. That are talking at like a 300% rise in ransomware. So it's very interesting where, and I don't think that actually negates anything that you said about it declining. I think what it is, it more makes the point that you just said, that you can't get kind of relaxed about it because one person's saying, oh, no, nobody does that anymore. Yes, they do. Whatever it is, anything, ransomware or otherwise, because we're seeing more people utilize this as a service model and are getting into doing it, realizing, wait, I can actually make money doing this, even though it's illegal. And so it's kind of interesting. Let me cover a couple of ways of doing ransomware as a service, and we can talk a little bit about this specifically here. I've seen two kind of models exist for you guys in the audience: an affiliate model here and a licensed model, basically, that exist. And with the affiliate model, the really interesting part is you can see here what the cost of entry is to build an affiliate network here of people that want to leverage a piece of ransomware. Basically, the idea is it's given out for free, but they've got to pay a profit share to the company that created the ransomware in the first place. So that it's a very interesting model because now you don't even have to worry about coding it, money up front. I mean, nothing. You're just willing to take, basically the ransomware authors are saying, hey, we're good at making ransomware. We're not willing to take the risk of like trying to send it out to people and have them try to find us and the payment stuff. We don't want to do that. We're just coders. We're developers, as an example. And so instead, if you're willing to take that risk, cool. We want between 20 and 40% of the profit. You keep the rest of it. It's an interesting model. The other one is the license model that we're used to seeing. Oh, by the way, this comes from the Deloitte Black Market Ecosystem report from this year. From the same report, you see the licensed model here. There is a cost of entry. There's a license fee of, you can see a range there, $250 to $650. It's not bad. At the same time, there's an average sort of estimated cost per license, and this license cost is sort of I'm doing air quotes here in my office. It's sort of like looking at the number of victims that you'd be able to hit based off of the money that you spend. I don't know that second number is all that important. Probably the average cost of entry is kind of important. In that same report, there was like there was at least like one instance of a piece of ransomware that I think was like $1,800. I don't know what makes it so much better, but there's these different models here where it's really a business model, just like anything else. And if you think of any other as a service, since you're all in the audience, you're IT folks, you think about even, let's say, like backup as a service or DR as a service. The idea is somebody else has the infrastructure, somebody else has the personnel and the staffing, somebody else is doing all that work, and you're just paying for the service. It's legitimately what's going on here with ransomware as a service. Somebody else does the tech support and codes and make sure that they work out the bugs, and they maybe even collect the money and just send you the check for whatever you've done, or not check, but the Bitcoin and so on. So it's a very interesting state that we're in. Christine, what do you think is behind the rise in interest and use of ransomware as a service? Is some of the stuff I've mentioned something else? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a lot of what you mentioned. This is actually quite fascinating to me. I know it's illegal, but we got to admit it's creative.
Yeah.
I can't say, so behind all of these attacks are always people, fundamentally, right? And people love convenience, and that criminals and attackers included. And so I think the same way, to your point, that as an industry and as a society, we all love service-based things where we don't have to deal with the infrastructure and the development and all of that, and we can just do things a lot more seamlessly and conveniently. And I think it's the same case here. There's a high demand for ransomware. If you do it right, it's very lucrative for these attackers. And so we'll call them cybercriminal entrepreneurs, have seen this as a business opportunity, right? And they've followed in the footsteps of our tech industries and all of the success that has been seen there. And so, using these services, they're able to launch everything from very, beginner level attacks to things that are more advanced, like any service would work. These manufacturers, or however you want to name them, create these kits, they advertise them, they rent access to them to others, and they provide the resources and the instructions to to make that happen. And so when somebody purchases it, they have the opportunity to launch these attacks. And if the person pays the ransom, then of course there's different pricing models for how that profit gets split, almost like a service fee. And so this setup is perfect for a consumer who may not know how to code or how to create an attack, but there's people who are really good at that, to your point. And so having somebody who knows how to develop this, doesn't want the direct exposure of launching the attacks, doesn't want to get their hands dirty directly. It's a win-win for both situations. So I call it almost like it was created for cyber criminals by cyber criminals. And so it's definitely flourishing. But I would also say, like, and you touched on this a little bit, like these aren't small mom and pop shops of people, doing things in their basements. Like these are often run as legitimate service businesses, so professional that they include the customer support, they include SLAs, they include satisfaction guarantees, even depending on what you're willing to pay, elite premium level support and more. One popular example is a provider called, I believe it's pronounced Jokeru. And unlike most of the ransomware as a service offerings, in order to access this one, you have to purchase almost a membership package, right? And these packages can range anywhere from $90 in USD, where similar to the kind of setup you have up on the screen, they end up earning 85% of the ransom payment, and then the rest is a fee to the provider. All the way up to packages that are $300, $600 and beyond, where people get to keep all of the revenue, these attackers, and they also get extra perks even thrown in, like encryption benefits, different access to different variants of ransomware, different payment options, and different cryptocurrencies. I mean, it goes on and on. There's even software that allows you to access visually appealing dashboards and analytics about the attacks that you're launching, and the ability to view information on the victims, whether or not they've paid their ransom, all kinds of stuff. So I think it's pretty wild. But when you think about it, attackers don't have to spend their precious time building these attacks anymore. With the increased popularity of these services, it's just a lot easier to accomplish, and what once required tons of planning and investment and preparation can now be purchased as a subscription, like you would video streaming service or anything else online.
Yeah, totally agree. It's one of those things where I love what you said. You could basically have anybody walking off the street. I'm kind of paraphrasing your words, but someone who knows nothing about coding, and so they could become a cyber criminal by tomorrow. It's not too hard. One of our audience members, Gary, says exactly. I have friends who argue this point. It is a business. It's like in essence, it can be very easily for these folks. And I like that you said these are legitimate businesses. The way I always put it is there was a leak of some documents from a cyber criminal organization. I forget what the name was. It was a couple years back, but it showed the inside what was going on. It was like they had a board of directors and they had revenue targets and they were doing proper accounting, and they have benefits for their employees. I mean, it's really real businesses. These are not like, I always say it this way, it's no longer like the guy in the hoodie hunched over his laptop in the dark room at 3 a.m. on a Saturday. That's not it anymore. These are legitimate businesses. So Moyara is actually asking a quick question I think we should probably address. They're asking, how does the original Cybercriminal Entrepreneur know how much ransomware is collected by the licensee? And I think that maybe you're thinking of it a little backwards, and if I may. And what I mean by that is the owner of the ransomware, let's say like in the affiliate model, the owner of the ransomware still owns the ransomware. They're letting you use it, and then what happens is the payment goes to the company that owns the ransomware, and then they distribute out the sharing of the profit out to the affiliate. Usually the affiliate networks, the person that owns the affiliate network is the one that's collecting all the money, and they pay the affiliates out. So that's how they know, because basically the affiliate's doing the dirty work of getting the ransomware out to the infected companies and victims, but the collection of the money is done by the company that is owning it. So Christine, I'm wondering, do you see sort of a greater risk to the potential victim because there's a couple people involved. We're not, in some cases, I think you're going to get lots of little vendors that pop up, go, I have ransomware as a service too, and maybe the code's not as good. It's like any other sort of free market, if you will. There are going to be really great players and some not so great players. So do you think that there's a greater risk to victims?
Yeah, I would say kind of yes and no. It depends. If hit with ransomware, of course, there's always a risk, right? Many of which we've touched on a little bit already. But I think generally, when you think about the fact that most victims here are unable to recover their data 100% anyway, no matter which way you turn, unless they have backups or some other kind of technology to prevent the attack. I think the risk is always going to be there. Now, if we're strictly talking about ransomware as a service, interestingly enough, I think what we're seeing is that in some cases these providers, they want to stay in business, and so they provide the keys or whatever is needed to try to decrypt the data once the payment is made. But the problem is still that even with those keys, again, it doesn't guarantee full data restoration. The average, and I think you mentioned this before, I'd read the same report, you lose roughly 8 to 10% of your data, even if you do try to recover it. And so I think that risk is still there. Even as an example, there's another ransomware as a service provider called Phobos, and in the case of their subscribers, they saw an increased downtime for the victims that they targeted because of the vendor's model. So their staff at this RaaS provider, their staff are typically less organized. They tend to, according to reviews at least, because people leave reviews, they tend to lack a little more professionalism in comparison to some of the other more mature entities. And so that has led to challenges in negotiations and increase in complications when they're trying to decrypt stuff. And so it's been one of those cases where even if somebody wants to, fold and do the right thing, the risk is higher that you're not going to get your information back anyway. And so, yeah, they say you get what you pay for, and I guess the dark web services are no exception.
Yeah, I always think of it this way, even though, encryption and decryption is sort of age-old, an age-old technology, age-old process, just in concept, not in specific execution. I used to look at it this way. The data is being manipulated. It was manipulated once to be encrypted. It's got to be manipulated again to be decrypted. And I don't know whether these people are good or bad, and whether I really like that 92% stat, because that really kind of speaks to the fact that it's not a guarantee. It's it still might happen. So a couple of comments here came in. It's interesting. Aland came up with a very interesting perspective here. It says, doesn't this also provide a great option for insider threats? I'm like, well, it kind of does. You can get an insider that decides they want to be an affiliate, get back at their company, and just hold them all for ransom and make money off their company. Yeah, you could.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And then Dave says the more the potential players, the more the threat, which makes good sense. Like it said, yeah, they've got lots and lots of people taking opportunistic chances of trying to, or even in their own company, like in the insider threat thing. So that makes sense there. And then Gordina says, you think this is as a result of the increase in RaaS as legal businesses, that it poses greater threats for more businesses being targets. Because it's a business to start with, it's not just some Yahoo. Do you think I kind of agree. I think it makes sense. Since it's real businesses with real software, there's sort of I'm doing air quotes here, a customer confidence in the product, that being the ransomware as a service, that it does pose a greater threat for businesses. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think to some of the points we discussed earlier, it's so much more accessible to pretty much anyone, whether you have a security background or are a homegrown hacker or not. You have the ability to launch these attacks, and so the more companies there are, the more people who have access to this software, the more that landscape will expand. So yes, totally agree.
So let's talk a little bit about, let's move on to, we've talked about the problem enough. Let's talk about ways to protect and to detect. And I've got this kind of broken into two parts here. The first part, just talk about sort of the protection. And I think that protection and that preparation occurs in sort of a layered approach. that I'm going to use the word layered even once more inside of that context, but there's a couple of different angles to come at the whole thing. The first one is looking at the environment. I'm a very big believer in layered security. Christine, I'm going to assume that you are as well. And in fact, I'm going to ask you a little bit about that in a moment here. For you guys in the audience, think back to the days of like King Arthur, and they have knights and that sort of thing, and lots of castles. My wife and I have been to France a number of times. We've gone around throughout France and seen lots of different what we call chateaus, which are castles. And what you end up learning, it's just like the stuff we learned sort of as kids and so on, is you always see like, oh, well, we all know what's outside of a castle. What's outside of a castle is it's a moat, right? And the reason why the moat's there is so that you've got to have a boat. Or something like that, or a canoe, or something to get across the moat. But then if that person happens to get across the moat, what do? Well, you have another layer of security, but do it from a different angle. You have a second moat. You have a very tall wall. Why? Well, if you had a boat, you probably don't have a ladder. But if you happen to have a boat and a ladder, okay, so now someone's climbing up the very tall wall. You want to come up not with a taller wall, you go with a different layer. So you go with vats of tar. You start dropping the vats of tar on the people that are climbing up the ladders because they're kind of stationary there, walking up in a easy, one direction there. And then if that doesn't work because they happen to have tar-proof umbrellas, just go with me. Then the next step is let's have archers. We'll come out from a totally different angle and we'll shoot them with archers. All right. Well, if they happen to have, let's say, some kind of armor on, and they have the tar-proof umbrellas, and they have the ladder, and they have the boats. Well, then the next thing is we have men with swords at the top to fend them off. I mean, the idea is you keep having multiple layers that attack the problem from a different angle, and those multiple layers are put in place under the assumption that the previous layer is going to fail to some degree. And that's a good place. But it doesn't mean it is going to fail. It means you should design a layered security strategy making that assumption. That way you're going, all right, if these two things don't work, how else could I try to approach the problem? Because I don't want to put more antivirus or more of the same thing in. I want to do something different because that first version didn't work. So that's one aspect. The second part of this is thinking about your systems and your data. And I'm underlining cloud here for cloud backups. Christine mentioned this a little bit early on of having backups of your data. It's been shown time and time again, the ransomware authors are now getting really creative. They're actually looking for, I think it's 42 different types of file extensions that are backup data files, and they're searching for them and trying to delete them if they can. They're also trying to leverage some of the lateral movement technology where they try to get elevated credentials, eventually trying to find a set of credentials that has API access to your backup software. And they'll try to also identify your backup software, access it through the API, and then request that backups be deleted. I mean, these guys are getting really nasty. So I always want to have backups that not only follow sort of the 3-2-1 backup rule, which the 2 is the one is one of them is offsite, usually it's cloud today, but just making sure that it's offsite somewhere where it can't be touched by a piece of ransomware. And then the last one here is the users, and I'm always thinking about security awareness training. A lot of ransomware, if not most of it, is coming through some kind of phishing attack, utilizing social engineering, and users are the first one to go, oh, I didn't know I had an account at Dinosaur Bank. I guess I better change my password then. Click. And hold on, you're supposed to delete that thing, but they didn't. And so we want to train those people to go, if it looks suspicious, if it looks bad, just assume it's bad, and let's go there. So Christine, what kinds of tech do you recommend as part of sort of a layered security strategy approach?
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan, of course, of layered security. I like to look at it through the lens of what do we need to do to prevent, detect, and respond, of course, and how can we do that through people, process, and technology. I think that's a pretty standard framework, and I think it works really well when it comes to layering. I would say from a technology standpoint, you need pretty much everything. You need adequate, email security, network security, device security controls, patching is important, vulnerability management. I mean, the list goes on and on. I think all of the basics that you can think of when it comes to creating a security program, you need those layers, which end up being your, moats and your tar and all of those things that you mentioned earlier on. But, for example, I know that email is a primary delivery vector for ransomware, and people like to click on things. I deal with it day in and day out. And so scanning and blocking these emails before they even make it into end users' mailbox, having those devices and software updated. So if something does get in, you're not able to be exploited. Network segmentation as well to help limit the spread if something does make it into your environment. All of those layers, again, can help limit the success of an attack and also help you, kind of isolate things. I think in terms of we're talking about both detection and protection here. You touched on this already, but backups are absolutely critical when it comes to ransomware response. And there's technology that exists to help with this process because if you have adequate backups, and you're able to, just wipe the machines and reinstall a clean image. That's ultimately the easiest way to kind of get, I shouldn't say easy, it's not always easy, but I think it's the most straightforward way maybe to get past this and recover. The key word there, though, is reliable, because the last thing you want is to think you're safe with backups, right, only to find that the process has failed. Which, we've seen that happen time and time again. An example from this year is Arizona Beverage Company, who got hit with ransomware. They, like many, had hundreds of servers encrypted. And when they went to, go back and revert to their backups, there was some issue or some misconfiguration to where that didn't work out as planned. And so that company elected not to pay the ransom and had to endure, kind of similar to, Baltimore or some of these other cases, that painful and expensive process of rebuilding assets that were lost and trying to recover.
Sorry, I was on mute there. If I can one-up you, there's a great story from, it's either earlier this year or late last year. It's the MatSu Borough in Alaska. And that's the government offices for that particular borough, and they got hit with ransomware. I forget which one it was, and but what happened was it actually encrypted 500 of their workstations, all 500. Which, first off, I wasn't even aware there was 500 workstations in Alaska. That's my little Alaska joke. But anyways, and then and they always think of like just snow and igloos and sled dogs, and they had 500 computers. And then the other part of that is it encrypted 120 of their 150 servers. And then your note about backups. They too had problems with backups to the point where they had to greenfield their Exchange servers completely. They didn't even have any email. They couldn't revert to anything. Even a year ago, nothing. Greenfield. It was horrible. One other question on this, on the preparation part. So I know that in your career, you've done a lot around cybersecurity awareness. So would you talk a little bit about the kinds of training and programs in place that you think will help thwart ransomware attacks?
Yeah, sure, of course. Like I mentioned before, like most of these attacks usually, start from people, right? And they also tend to require some kind of human action to execute. Not always. We've seen people get more advanced there as well, but for the most part, there tends to be human beings involved. And so whether it's through a malicious email message, we talked about phishing, or if it's, an infected, pop-up or ad or something, once a user clicks on something, that's when the damage begins. And so I focus a lot on trying to make sure that people are aware of risks associated with clicking on things you shouldn't and beyond, because people play an important role in all of this. And so I think it's just important to help people understand what they should and shouldn't be doing, because we can't expect employees or end users to be cybersecurity experts, right? That's my job, or that's your job. We can't expect them to know everything, so we have to make sure that we educate them on how, in this case, we're talking about ransomware, we have to be able to educate them on how that works, or how whatever risk you're looking at, they need to understand not just, how it works or how it can impact them, but also empower them with what they need to do about it or how they can protect themselves. I feel like once you do that well, people can go from being, what most would call the weakest link in organizations to being one of the most powerful assets. Now, the scope and approach to training and awareness will vary based on the, company and on the culture. But this is an area where this is probably one of my favorite areas. But I like to get creative and have a lot of fun in this space. So in my world, like I've done everything from host, interactive awareness sessions to creating games where people can learn more about different cybersecurity topics, ransomware included. I run global hack fests that, people, no matter how entry level or advanced you are in technology or even beyond, people can participate in. Simulated phishing campaigns help a lot, because the more people, get tested and realize that these attacks are very real and start to learn how to be suspicious of emails and of links and things like that, the better they are. We tend to see huge reductions in incidents and in employees clicking on emails from programs like that. I think people just get excited to learn more when you make it fun. One of my favorite things to do is I host these social engineering demo sessions, and ransomware can be tied into that as well too. But we ask people, or customers, employees, anybody, we ask people not to do a lot of these things. You don't use weak passwords. Don't click on emails that could have ransomware in them. But I think until you help people understand why you're asking them to do that, it doesn't really sink in. And so we actually walk people through from the view of an attacker. When you click on this link, here's what the ransomware page looks like, and here's what's going on the back end, and here's why you won't get your data back. And I think once you help people understand that a little bit more, that helps. I think the other piece is to make it personal, so employees just don't get targeted with, ransomware or with malicious emails and things like that at work alone. They get that at home too. Their families get it as well and can be hit. And so when you're able to show people that you care enough to share information that can help them beyond just business, that can help them protect themselves, to protect their kids, spouses, parents, and so on, people tend to appreciate that, because this is something that you can't force people to care about this. I find that it works much better when you're inspiring people to care. And I think the other angle from an awareness and from a training standpoint is it's not just stopping people from clicking on these attacks, on these links, or on prohibiting people from bringing things into the environment. It's also helping people so that they know what to do, they know what action to take. I think oftentimes we forget that we have people who are out there. They're our eyes and ears, and if something is going on, you want them to be able to come back to the organization as quickly as possible to say something. Then they're your first line of defense. And so I think just having a process also for people to be able to report stuff like this, and not feel like they should be embarrassed or ashamed or afraid to say, like, hey, I clicked on this and I now have this ransom, and I'm not going to try to pay it under the table. I'm going to, go to the right team and get the right people involved. You have to create that environment where people are aware of what they need to do and they feel confident with coming to the right folks to get help. I mean, I could go on and on about training and awareness. Again, it's one of my favorite topics. There's an entire framework that I like to use. But I think all in all, this training and this awareness is something that I think can make a huge difference, because human beings play such a big role in this. And the last plug that I'll say for this part is Awareness Month is coming up. It's October. And I think that's just a good opportunity for people to engage and get behind something bigger. So tons of stuff that you can do from an October Awareness Month around ransomware and other topics as well.
Very good. No, I love that, and I'm in complete agreement. And one of the things I love that some of the vendors have done to try and take away some of that embarrassment that users might have, if they think they might become a victim and so on, is at least pressing the Outlook plugins and that kind of thing, where they can at least give some kind of feedback to IT saying, I think this might be a phishing email. Even if it's too late, at least something that helps, and it keeps IT in the loop as opposed to them saying nothing, which I like. So We've got about 12 minutes left, a little bit on this slide and one more slide after that. So I think we have just enough time to get this done. We'll be right at the top of the hour. There's a couple of questions that have come in. I'm probably going to hold some Bob and Gary, guys. I'm going to hold your questions, I think, just to the end to make sure we have them answered, but they're really good questions too. So the second part of this is the idea of detection. And there's a few ways that happens. And again, on the endpoint, you've got things like anti-malware and endpoint protection solutions, things like that. They're really what they're looking for more than anything. If you look at this, it's abnormal processes, something that shouldn't be running, or in some cases, it needs to be more about application behavior, because there's things like direct memory injection, where a piece of malware, like a piece of ransomware, might actually go and be loaded directly into memory, may even bore out the area of RAM being held by a known good process. I like to use the ridiculous example of Notepad. And so Notepad is running in memory, and they'll bore out the process. And what they'll do is they'll stick their own ransomware, malware code in there, and then it looks like Notepad's doing stuff. So if you were to stop at just processes, you go, oh, that's Notepad. It's cool. Notepad can do whatever it wants. It's just Notepad. But instead, it's, well, what's Notepad doing? Why is Notepad calling up PowerShell? That kind of thing. But that's weird. That's application behavior, and so that's when you start to look and see what's going on the endpoint. Then you've got backups, and there are even solutions that are built into backups that look for excessive numbers of changes to a backup set before it's actually backed up. So that's another way of detecting and making sure that you don't back that up. And then the last one here on systems is things like honeypots, and it's a great way of doing it where you're actually putting a solution in place that is designed to try and attract a ransomware first, so it can be detected. It can be then being able to be told that it's doing what it thinks it's doing. Hey, you're encrypting everything. It's fine. Yes, you're doing all your malicious nastiness. Yes, it's all working. Thumbs up. But in reality, behind the scenes, it's doing absolutely nothing to the systems involved. So there's a couple of ways that happens here. Christine, what methods are you seeing be most effective at detecting ransomware?
Yeah, I think all of these are really good examples. This covers quite a bit of it. I think oftentimes when we're talking about, attackers and detection, and, people stay in networks undiscovered for days and months and years without being detected. They're trying to get in, get what they need and get out without causing a scene. But I think in the nature of ransomware attacks, it's a little different. Like, sure, they might, keep quiet for a while they look for, what processes or what machines are most valuable to hit, maybe. But once that ransomware is launched, they're not hiding and trying to keep quiet, right? They want to be paid. And so the impact can almost be immediate. And so you want to try to detect it before it even gets to that point. And I think a lot of the things that you mentioned already cover a lot of that. I would say, in addition, just solutions that screen for known ransomware variants, indicators of compromises. You talked about honeypots. I think all of that is very relevant. An interesting one to me is as providers start to integrate more, artificial intelligence in solutions, they're getting smarter, faster, and better at detecting some of these attacks with greater context. To your point with, OneNote and calling processes that are probably shouldn't, or executing things it shouldn't. But I think the most advanced solutions for detection in this space can even start to intercept ransomware commands to lock the files. Do things like, make a clean copy of the data and safely store it somewhere else in real time. I think that's where we're starting to see a shift, and we're starting to see game changers between, just looking for anomalies versus actually enabling some immediate action. So I think those kinds of technologies where you can even start to, block different accounts or processes that are trying to encrypt data, and configuring alerts for that. All of those things I think are a step ahead, and where we need to continue to focus as we elevate in ways that we detect these kinds of attacks.
Yeah, totally agree there. So let's do this. Let's talk about one last slide here. We've got about 8 minutes left, and then we can take a couple of questions. I think there's some really good ones that have come in here. You did get a little feedback from Gordina. They said really good ideas for security awareness. So if you haven't written a book on it, you probably should. And we'll talk about that afterwards. So if ransomware hits, I've got 6 steps here, and these are really high-level steps because it's not every environment's different, so it's hard to go. If you just paint all your networks blue, you'll never have ransomware. It doesn't work that way. It's not one size fits all. So I got a couple of different things I want you to be thinking about. The first one here is you've got to isolate the infection. First, it means you have to obviously identify it, but you also have to isolate it, make sure that it's not going to spread anymore. So that might be with things like even network virtualization. It could just be unplugging the machines that are affected. And that's what City of Baltimore ended up doing. They just had to shut everything down. They didn't know. They just had no clue. And they know how to find it. They didn't have a solution in place. And so they couldn't isolate very well. So they just shut everything down. That was their method of isolation, but it's got to be done. You've heard both Christine and I stress backups. That should be the plan. The plan should be proactively, I have enough backups of everything to make sure that if I get hit with ransomware, that I'm okay. However, I'm going to just interject one thing here. There is a new kind of attack methodology where they're creating an attack loop. And what they do is they'll put ransomware on a machine and then they'll have it lie dormant for 6 months, literally 6 months, so that you get lots of backups of that machine with the ransomware on there. And then when the day hits, okay, it's August, whatever today is, 22nd or something, go ahead, turn on, it turns on, you have ransomware on the machine. So what do? Let me restore to yesterday. Guess what? When yesterday's recovers, hey, it's August 22nd, turn that thing on, infects the machine again. And you keep going, it becomes an attack loop. It's really nasty stuff. So you've also, as part of this, as if backups are your go-to and you're comfortable there, you got to be thinking about, for sure, that I have a way of absolutely being certain a machine does not have ransomware on it, to the best of your ability. So that's number 2. Number 3 is you have to do the math, the ransom versus the remediation. Again, City of Baltimore, 760,000 versus 18 million. Now, I think if you do this proactively, especially when we're talking about backups, if you have a DR strategy, I do a lot of talking about DR and business agility and availability and that sort of thing. And if you know that your DR plans are going to work, or even you have like DR as a service and you've actually got replication of servers up to the cloud and things like that, and you're ready to just flip the switch, then you can go, we can remediate really fast. If you're not sure, you got to do the math, because sometimes it might just be cheaper to pay the ransom. But again, you have to do the math. You've got to identify the entry point. That might mean, Christine even mentioned things like, patching and vulnerability management. It might be that the entry point is a known vulnerability on a given, we still have a Windows XP machine we didn't know about, or whatever it is. Or it could be, Johnny in accounting and they clicked on something and it's more of a security awareness training issue. Whatever it is, you got to identify that, and then you've got to figure out how you're going to show up your security and improve the security stance that you have, so that at a minimum, that exact same thing doesn't happen again. If we know it's a patching issue, let's get everything patched. If it's a user issue, let's get the users trained, whatever the case is. Christine, last question here, because we only have a couple minutes left, but what other suggestions would you give to our audience around how to respond to ransomware attacks?
I think this covers the main points, definitely. I'll just add one quick point on another trend that's being seen as watch out for cover-ups and sneak attacks, right? Everything isn't always what it seems. And so while the main kind of goal of ransomware right now is usually, digital extortion and kind of, getting money out of people, attackers are also starting to use this as a creative way to cover their tracks and, encrypt and lock up your log files, for example, so that when they are trying to do other things and leak data and stuff like that, not only are you now being asked to pay ransom, but you can't really see everything that's been done depending on how it's delivered. And so I think these are all, great recommendations. Again, I feel like from an incident response standpoint, you have to have a really strong process that really looks at what the, root cause is, and make sure that you're prepared and not making some of these decisions or realizations in the middle of an attack, because every minute matters.
Excellent. So let's do this. We've got about 3 minutes left. The webinar today has been brought to you by Veriato. Veriato is a product called RansomSafe. This kind of falls in the honeypot category that I talked about early on. I'm not here to pitch you the product, but in essence, this is a solution that adds to your layered security strategy, acts as a honeypot, tries to attract the ransomware, allows it to think that it's doing something really bad, when in fact what it's doing is it's actually intercepting all the encrypt commands on servers and not allowing anything to actually be encrypted, even though it tells the ransomware that it is doing some badness. So I'll leave this up here as well. You can go to veriato.com and take a look at that. And while we've got about 2 minutes left, I'll go through kind of a couple of comments here. I think you had mentioned early on, Gary said people, process, and what? I'm thinking you maybe said people, process, and technology early on. Did you say that when you said it was a combination of? Was that
Yes,
you?
Yes, I did.
Was it people, process, and technology?
Yes, it was.
Okay, I missed that question, Gary. I should have asked in context. I do apologize, but there's that. Gary asks, was it Gary? Where's it at? No, someone asked and I missed it. There we go. So Bob asks, is ransomware considered a breach? And it's an interesting question, because data breaches are typically exfiltration, stealing of data taken out, and ransomware is more of data manipulation. What's your thought on that, Christine?
My take is it's not from a sense of what I think generally breaches are called. I would constitute a breach like where somebody got in and left with something, and people define it in different ways, right? I would say it's more of a I don't know, it's a security incident or
Yeah.
catastrophe, however you want to define
I
it.
would say it this way. We say data breach because data was breached and taken out. But in essence, your network's breached. I mean, there is a breach. Someone got in. So I would definitely say, in my mind, is it a
Yeah,
data breach
I would
according to like
agree.
data breach notification laws and things like that? No. But the other thing is here is someone got a piece of malware. Yes, it's ransomware, but it's a piece of malware on lots of your machines. How do you know that someone doesn't have a piece of malware that does ransomware and does
Right.
exfiltration of data? Which actually
Yeah.
brings to Bob's other half of the question. He says, besides cipher keys, how do we know how much data is actually transmitted off site? And that's going to be purely network monitoring, deep packet inspection. I mean, those kind of things. Christine, thought on that about data leaving, even though that's not
Yeah, no.
exactly on topic here.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think what people generally see in the headlines are data breaches, and so people automatically assume that once you mention breach, that data has left. Where that's not the case with ransomware, I guess is what I'm getting at. But totally agree. I think it definitely constitutes a breach.
All right, very good. So a couple people ask things like a copy of the slides. The folks from Veriato, make sure you get those out. Will be a copy of the presentation that'll be sent, a copy of this actual presentation that'll be emailed to you as well. We got a thank you from someone here. And then Christine, someone actually wants to speak to you about awareness training, so that's kind of cool. The Veriato folks can get you there. And then just one last
Sure.
question. We're at the top of the hour, but Gary's asking what tools and applications and/or software that you know of can possibly assist in detection. The biggest thing here is going to be probably something on the endpoint, something that isn't more than just. I mean, with the anti-malware stuff today is good because it is doing. You mentioned Christine. You mentioned AI, machine learning, that kind of thing. There's a lot of vendors that are doing threat intelligence where they're doing collective, like if they're managing millions and millions of endpoints, they're collecting all of that together and utilizing that collective threat intelligence to figure out what they should be updating for their engines to detect. So in general, I would probably start there. If you're being preventative, I would probably have DNS scanning, email scanning, web scanning, that sort of thing. Christine, any brief what other things that someone should probably have and to assist with detection?
Um, I think that covers everything that I would add.
Okay,
Yeah.
very good. Well, Christine, thank you for a great conversation. I really appreciate your input. Obviously, you've got a ton of industry knowledge. We appreciate you spending an hour here to kind of give some of that to the audience today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, and for those in the audience, thanks for your comments. Thanks for your questions. We'll hope to see you on the next webcast. So thanks a lot for your time today, and we'll catch you on the next one. This concludes today's webcast.